Welcome back. Today is a big day. We are going to be putting really heavy duty links on our 4Runner project. Let's get into it. We've got this link kit, and this thing is truly awesome. It is a plug and play, a bolt-in kit. We've got lower links, super heavy duty, upper links, and our panhard bar that is going to replace our factory stuff. All right, first things first, we'll put our light in our factory light mount location. We have got to disconnect the sway bar, these factory shocks, get these springs out of here. We can let the suspension droop out. Probably have to disconnect the brake line as well. And maybe the ABS wire. And then we can start taking links out one by one and replacing them with the new ones. Since we're not going to be reusing these sway bar end links, I went ahead and took an angle grinder and just cut through the bushing and cut through the rod. That way all of this can come out super easy. I can just unbolt it from the axle. If you've ever done shocks on one of these 3rd gen 4Runners, then you know how much of a pain it is to get to this upper shock bolt. You think that they would have put a little cubby right here, a little cutout that you could get into with a wrench, but no. And I'll show you what makes this even worse. So here's the shock from the bottom. It comes up, it goes into this big piece of steel up here, right here. It's a stem type, so there's just a threaded portion, a bolt essentially, on the end of this that goes up through this whole thing, and it's just up in there. The only way to get to it is you gotta fish your hand up inside on top of here, in between. That's the body, and this is this plate here, and the bolt is all the way back in here. It's a real nightmare. You would think at least like in the body somewhere, like you could go inside in the interior, that there would be like a panel that you could unbolt, pop up, and then the top of the shock bolt would be right there, but that's not the case either. Everything else probably take 20 minutes to take off. This one bolt may take you up to an hour. to whatever dumb, lazy, this is more work. It's more work. Whoever you are You dumb mechanic at some B-rate shop that put 3 nuts on top of that shock post, just know, if I ever find you, you're swallowing these. God. Well, luckily my camera wasn't recording when I cut this off, so you guys don't get to see it. All right, we're gonna start with one link at a time. We'll take a link off, we'll take it to the bench, we'll set the new link to approximately the same length, and then we'll take it over, install it, and then tighten up the heim joints in the vehicle. Make sure that we do all of them the same, or at least to what the factory links are set. All right, our old lower one measures 21 1/16. Ta-da! All right, now we just do that 3 more times and the links are done. All right, all the new links are in. Everything except for the panhard bar. That's right here. We'll do that last. We've got a bracket we're gonna weld on there and a bracket we're gonna weld on here for a panhard correction on this guy. And frankly, the factory brackets are not even like perfect for the factory setup. They should be just a little bit taller. There's the new links in. We've got a longer brake line we'll install here too. And then we'll test out our springs to see how our springs are gonna sit. I'd have to order more springs. And then once we get figured out stuff with the springs, then we'll start working on bump stops for the rear. All right, we got all the links in. All that is done. This brake line right here, as you can see, is pretty much maxed out, but we have a spare braided stainless brake line that's a little bit longer than this one. So what we're gonna do before we do our mounts for our panhard bar, we're gonna go ahead and get this brake line tackled. There's an ABS wire up here that is pretty roached. Let's see if I can get it in video here. Right there. Somebody decided it'd be a good idea to solder that back together. So that will be adding to the list of small things that we gotta fix too. Let's get this brake line taken care of, we can get those brackets on. All right, so we got the new brake line installed. The next thing on the list is this panhard correction kit. Now this is a really nice kit. It's about $100 and the installation on it is super easy. All you gotta do is remove the factory paint, and in this case, the factory rust. This bracket only goes on one way, sits on there like that. Just align it where it fits the best with the least amount of gaps, and then you just weld this all the way around, weld it on the inside, try to make it look nice and strong. And then we have a bracket for the adjacent side over here, and I'll show you how that one goes on when we get to that point. All right, what I've gone ahead and done is ground a chamfer in the factory bracket all the way around. That way, when I put this on here and weld it, it has a place for all that metal to really burn into. That's better than this outside kind of rusty stuff. right, here's the bracket for this side. Gone ahead and cleaned this up. I'll show you how this goes on here. It's pretty intuitive. Basically, pushes on over the outside. You line it up with the holes and voila. Then you weld around here and down and all the way around, and then it drops this bracket from here 2 inches down, which is really nice. These brackets are really well made, really well thought out. We're gonna do something on this one that I did on mine. May not be necessary. I think if you can make something stronger without that much more work, it's worth to do. What we're gonna do is, since we're not gonna be using this upper bolt hole, to add a little strength into this whole thing after we get it welded, I've got this shock bushing sleeve that perfectly fits up inside of here, in between, and then we'll take this grade A bolt and we'll run it through our bracket, through the plate, and we'll bolt that together up there along with it being welded on. The upper bracket is thinner on the factory and the upgrade, so adding a little bit of strength to it, I'm sure really wouldn't hurt. All right, I got those panhard brackets done, threw some paint on them, temporarily, semi-temporarily, put the panhard bar back in place, and then took my springs and just tossed my springs in there to see what the ride height is gonna be. Put the tires on. So there's that panhard bar right there on the new brackets. New springs are in. Probably can't tell in video, but it's sitting a little back high right now. And that's with, I put a tire in the back here to add a little bit of weight to the back, and it still sits pretty tall in the back, considerably. So I think what I'm gonna do is, I've already ordered different springs. I've ordered, these are like 4-inch lift springs. I ordered 2 to 2.5 inch lift springs, and then when those come in we'll pop them in. But for now, so we can do some other things while those are being shipped, I think for now what we're gonna do is pull the tires off, let the suspension droop out, and then pop these springs out, get them out of the way, and then we'll put the tires back on. We'll let the suspension compress to where the factory bump stops are. We'll see where the tires sit in the wheel well, kind of measure from there where we want to set our bump stops, and then game plan for where the bump stops are gonna go and where the shocks are gonna go, and we'll probably work on shock hoops in the meantime. This video was going to be initially just the links, but since those went relatively quickly, I mean, they were a pain in the ass, but since they went relatively quickly, then we've got some time, I think, to do some of those other projects. All right, this is up as far as it'll go. As you can see, the tire is completely into the fender. Even if I cut this, it really doesn't have much further up to go. If you look on this side, we've got a little bit of a gap, but if we look underneath, this bolt hits right here, and then everything over there is pretty much completely collapsed as far as it'll go. I think what we'll do is we'll lower this down just a little bit, and then we'll measure to set for our bump stops, and then take our shock measurements from there. I think this is as good as it's really gonna get. That's a lot of travel, to be honest. All right, well, I have been working on this rear suspension for about a week now, and I think I'm finally in a spot where I can share with you guys what I've been dealing with and why this has been taking so long. This rear suspension from the factory has rubber bushings in it. I'll show you those. They look like this. There's a little bit of space for wiggle room. They're made of rubber. They move around all over the place. Not super great if you're running bigger tires and doing hardcore stuff off-road. These use like a Heim joint, a typical, or like a rod in, a typical link style setup for most hardcore four-wheel drive enthusiasts. The issue is the factory geometry that Toyota developed for these 4Runners is pretty awful. For a factory car made in 1998, 1999, I guess it's actually pretty good. However, by most standards that people build link suspension off of, this is not what you want. It's not semi-triangulated, it's not parallel, it's a little bit of everything, and the geometry is simply terrible. So what does that mean for these links? Well, these links, they don't move. They're not like the rubber bushings. They don't have flex. They don't wiggle. They are solid, which is great if you're going to be using your vehicle in most hardcore off-road situations. It's not great if your factory link geometry is incorrect. So what happens is straight up and down, this axle pretty much moves how it should. However, when you put a panhard bar on here, this guy right there, the panhard bar will want to swing the axle side to side. It's just the nature of how it works. As this bar drops down further, it's going to swing in. As it goes up, it'll swing out. That combined with, you've got a link that comes in here and a link that comes in here, creating essentially a triangle. Those are going to want to resist the axle swinging back and forth. Same thing on the outside. Those come in a little bit. This one comes in a little bit. So all of that is going to want to resist the axle moving side to side. That creates binding. Now, I've gotten it to the point where it can go up and down and the binding is very minimal, if any at all. However, when you jack up one side, like you jack up this side, if you were flexing on a rock or something, this side binds. If you jack up this side, that side binds. It's worse on this side because you've got the panhard bar coming down to this location. You've got an upper link there and you've got a lower link there. That creates 3 points of contact in one spot, basically multiple converging triangles in one place. And so the binding is significantly worse on this side. If I take this bolt out, the binding almost essentially goes away. If I take that bolt out and I take that link out, 100% of the binding goes away. If I take that link out and put this bolt back and the panhard back in, 100% of the binding goes away. So that tells me that there's something with the geometry that just doesn't jive right. Unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable just leaving one of the links out since this is how all the brackets are designed to be run. I feel like it might cause undue stress on other things. I've gotten it to the point where it's really good. The maximum travel that I can get out of this suspension geometry is exactly 12 inches. And to show you, to illustrate that, this side of the axle is sitting on the jack stand. This side of the axle is floating ever so slightly. There's a gap there. Now, when I put weight on it, or I put a spring in here or a shock in here, it'll push that down. However, that does just show you that due to the amount of binding in this, it's actually holding that up about 3/8 of an inch. Pretty wild. So if you're looking at doing links and using the factory link location, or buying this kit, just know that you're going to have to mess with this for a while to get all the binding as good as possible. The tough part for me is I want to run this kit on mine as well. My 4Runner is taller than this one, which means I might potentially run into worse binding issues. We'll cross that bridge when I get there. If I have to change some things, I might just do that. But yeah, so this has taken me about a week to really diagnose and figure out. It was so bad at first that you would jack the axle up and then it would just stay there. It would not drop back down at all. So we've come a long ways in the last week. Now that that's figured out though, that leaves us ready to start doing the shocks in here and start doing the bump stops in here. I've already started on the other side. This shock tower is in place. I got a tab on this side. Frames been ground and ready for welding of those in. I went and got gas today so I can cut these off. These are the factory bump stops. We'll cut that off. The new hydraulic bump stop will go in place of this. And then this side will be buttoned up and we'll be ready to do the other side. All right, we got that all cleaned up. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna clean up the axle tube while I'm at it, that the bump stop is going to sit on, and get it ready for making the plates for the bump stop. All right, so the next thing that I'm gonna do is set up for our shock towers. These are pre-bent tubes. I think they were from either Rough Stuff or TMR. And I already know that I'm gonna need to cant this forward a little bit because our shock is gonna be sitting in front of the axle center line. I also know that I want the top kicked out a little bit. TMR also makes these really awesome mounts. They're called a tube mounting foot. Here's the part number right there, if you can see it. And it just looks really nice and is really strong. I've decided I'm going to put the long side in the front to give me a better angle on the shock hoop. So this is actually going to sit pretty much right there. Okay, so this side is nearly perfect. I cut that one right on the money. And this side has a little gap in the back side, about a 1/4 inch gap in the back side, and that's why you leave them about a 1/4 inch long. This actually needs to go down a little bit anyways, so once I clear this up and make it sit as nice as this one, it'll be sitting in the right place here and up here. Okay, so these tabs came with that shock tower, which is great. These normally just go right on here like that, and then you weld them out and you're done. However, we're mounting them parallel to the tube. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these dishes out that are made for tubes. I'm going to go ahead and just cut that flat. And then while I'm at it, I'm also going to trace out these brackets so we can make some more like it for the bottom. right, we got our original tabs. They've been cut off flat. I even put a little bevel in them so they would sit a little flatter on the tube for a better weld. And then we've got our copycat tabs for the bottom of the shock. All right, we got our tabs bolted up. All we're gonna do is position this where it's far enough forward, it's not going to bind up, and it's far enough up and out that when it droops, it's not gonna hit here, and we can get the most amount of travel out of this, which I'm thinking right about there is perfect. We'll get that tacked on and then go from there. With the upper shock tabs mounted, we can go ahead and move on to our lower shock tabs. I want to use this original bracket. It's plenty strong for what we need. The idea is these shock tabs hold it just far enough away that everything clears. However, the shock does look like it's sitting a little bit lower than I was anticipating. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and tack it in place either way. We'll cycle the suspension up to full bump, and we'll see where the shock sits. This is up as far as the shock will let me right now. As you can see, we are sitting on a little rubber bumper on the shock. With the tire on here, the tire pretty much touches basically where this trim piece comes up to. So that is perfect. I'm gonna leave that exactly how it is, and I'm gonna go ahead, start mocking up for the bump stop. I went ahead and made a frame plate to help stiffen up our frame here for our bump stop. This will go right over the top of the frame like this. It'll get welded in, and then our bump stop mounting tabs will weld directly to that. All right, so the bump stop is tacked in. You can see it here on the plate. I angled it a little bit so it matches the center line of the axle. Now the bump stop pad on the bottom doesn't have to be too crazy. You don't need a bunch of height to meet your frame, which in this case we don't. So all I'm gonna do is take a piece of 1/4 inch plate, just like this, and I'll make some short sides for it. We'll weld this together, we'll put it on the axle, and then we'll weld it onto the axle. And then this bump will have a nice strong place to hit against that's not just the top of the axle tube. All right, the bump stop's tacked in. The base plate for the axle is tacked in. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna cycle the axle up flat till bump, double check this, double check the shock, and then we're gonna cycle just this side up to full bump and then double check them both. Sometimes you get all the way to the end of something and you're double checking things and you realize stuff just simply doesn't fit. So the bump stop is great. The shock is great. However, the upper shock mount up here sticks too far out, and the tire is already starting to touch the shock. And we have 3 more inches of shock shaft to go up. So that's clearly not going to work. I'm going to have to take both of those upper shock tabs off, move them in to the inside, and then recycle the suspension and hope that the shock doesn't hit the frame then. And then get back to where I was before, which is getting ready to dismantle all this and final weld it all out, and then move on to the other side. I still have the whole other side to do. Okay, well, it has been another week, another set of shock tabs. This is the 4th iteration of shock tabs that I've worked on, trying to get this stuff to all fit in here. And once again, once the suspension cycles out, it does not fit. Either the shock hits the frame or the tire hits the shock. So I can't come further out and I can't go further in, at least without notching the frame, it looks like that's what I'm going to be doing. Unfortunately, too, because of these shock tabs, let me get a light. These shock tabs kind of have to go this way because I can't really put this hose out this way. The tire already hits the body of the shock here. This one in the back, I put in the press and I made it extra long and I actually bent it up like this. So it actually goes up like that and sticks out the back a little ways. So I could put this one lower and further in that way. The body of the shock is actually even with the shock tower here, which is roughly 3/4 of an inch further in that way than it was before. It's still not enough. When the tire comes up, it's actually still not enough. So much so that I took it out of the lower mount and I moved it over about an inch, and that got me a little bit closer to where I need. I mean, it's still less than a ½ inch away from the tire up here, even with that moved. So now I'm looking at doing another set of shock tabs that move this even further over. The other thing is I've been waiting on a 90-degree fitting here so I can move this hose, because now that I've moved this in, I'm now hitting that tube with this hose. So I ordered these 90s to go in here, which I ordered 90-degree elbow, half ORB to half ORB. Well, when I got this, these are like 3/4 of an inch. They're way too big. Way too big. I measured the threads. The threads measured ½ an inch. I ordered ½ an inch. Why can't we have things that are the right size? Why is it that I order ½ inch and they come in measuring 3/4 of an inch and not ½ inch? When I go on their website, if you go down to the very bottom, it says these fittings, in order for this fitting to be ½ an inch, you need to order 3/8. So now I'm gonna be waiting 3 or 4 more days on the next set of fittings just to try to get this put together. That's where we are. That's where we're at. This rear suspension was supposed to take 1 weekend to fully do. Put the links in, do the shocks, all of that. 1 weekend. We're now going on 6 weeks. Between cutting stuff off, putting stuff back on, having to order parts, cycling suspension, getting a hold of companies. It has been a real testament to my patience. But hopefully I can come up with something to get this to work correctly. And hopefully those 90-degree fittings show up and they are correct. That would help a lot. Yeah. Cross your fingers. Well, 5th time's a charm. These tabs are perfect. Tab. I haven't done the backside yet. This one is in the perfect amount where the tire doesn't rub by about ½ an inch. And I didn't have to move the bottom, which is great. I really didn't want to do that. It just barely clears the frame. Or I might be able to even cut it, bend it in, re-weld it. And it will have all the clearance that it needs. All right, so this is the final iteration. I think I finally got something that's gonna work. I had to make offset tabs. They have this bend in them. That way it can offset the shock further towards the back. I got the correct 90-degree fittings so we can move this hose out of the way so it won't be in that tube. All right, this side is all welded up. We'll do the other side and then start putting our new parts and pieces in. All painted. Shock tabs in, bump stop mount in, and I went ahead and I notched the frame out for clearance for the shock.
All right, we are finally ready to mount some shocks up in this thing, get the springs in, get it sitting on its own weight. But I wanted to touch on something first. You'll notice that this link is disconnected. It is sitting here not hooked up to the axle, and that is for a reason. No matter what I did, I could not get the binding out of this rear suspension. I'm sure it's just the factory link geometry is not good. However, Front Range Off-Road made these links, and they should have also known that when they were doing their testing. I reached out to them and I asked them if they have seen this problem before, or what I could do to try to alleviate the issue, and they said that most people set their links and don't have any problems, which I find that hard to believe. So unfortunately, that's all they really had on the matter. What they really need is they need a poly bushing on this side. If they had a poly bushing on the top side of that link, then it would allow for a little bit of binding and everything would still cycle relatively well. But it doesn't sound like they're wanting to talk about the issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to disconnect this one completely. I've got a reinforcement bracket coming for the other side. We will run one upper link, essentially making this a rear 3-link system instead of a semi-triangulated 4-link with a panhard. It'll probably work out just fine. Realistically, of course, I would like to run the complete kit that we paid for. But that's where we're at with it. Now, these bolts are extra long, and there's a purpose for that. It's called shanking. And what that is you've got a tab here and a tab here and a shock in between, and you want that long straight part of the bolt that doesn't have threads to sit where the shock is. That way the threads don't chew up the bushing of the shock. All right, shocks are on. The last thing we need to do to get this thing buttoned up is fill the shocks full of nitrogen. Now, these universal shocks, they do not come charged with nitrogen. That way you can do all your fab work and all your layout and test fit and all that stuff. And then you put nitrogen in them later, and then they're ready to go. So what I've done is I went and purchased a tank of nitrogen. This should last me a very, very long time at this size. And then I have a gauge. This side is for the tank pressure. This side is for the line pressure. What we're gonna do is hook it up to the Schrader valve right here on our reservoir. And then I'll fill the back half of this with nitrogen, priming the oil in the system. We've got the suspension all drooped out, so we're ready to do that. This part screws on. This part opens our Schrader. And we should be putting about 150 pounds of pressure in here to start with. Okay, that one is done. Well, ladies and gents, the rear suspension is done, finally. Let's get this thing off the jack. Nice. All right, well, that's gonna do it for us on this episode. Next episode, we are going to be tackling some armor. I've got skid plates currently getting painted up. We'll be doing some rock sliders. And then tackling a front bumper as well. We're also going to be re-gearing the rear end of this. So in the next few episodes, we're going to be re-gearing, adding some armor, and getting this thing ready to take on its maiden voyage. I am a little concerned with the weight of the skid plates and the bumper, that we're going to have to get some heavier weight springs for the front, but that is a challenge we will tackle when we get there. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you if you're subscribed. If you're not, consider subscribing. If you have any comments, concerns, questions, you want to see something, get down in the comments, let me know. Until next time, we are out.